My name is Gloria Consuelo. For my capstone presentation, I chose the theme Structured Learning Environments. Through this theme, I developed a competency statement, which is, I am competent at engaging students throughout the learning process in order to increase opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding. And so through my pieces of evidence, through my competency statement, I kind of came up with something that would stand out to me. And that is that E is for engagement, engaging everyone and everything. So for my first set of evidence, I used the guided question, how can I promote a safe learning environment for all students, specifically their intellectual well-being? And so for this piece of evidence, I pulled my first lesson plan from TAC 297A. It was designed for a kindergarten classroom at Randolph Elementary. And so as I reflect on my lesson plan and what I taught, I wanted to include an engagement strategy that was fun. So I created an iMovie to the song This Little Light of Mine, and the learning objective for that lesson was having students generate rhymes. And so we sang This Little Light of Mine, we read lyrics, we sang to it, and it was fun. And I thought I grabbed their attention, we can generate rhymes. Well, that wasn't the case. My kindergartners couldn't connect the idea of singing this song and actively participating in it to being able to generate rhymes on their own. So although it was fun and it got their attention, it didn't help my students conceptualize the learning objective and meet that standard of generating those rhymes. So through this piece of evidence, it got me thinking too, and it led me to my second set of evidence, and that was a lesson that I taught in a first grade classroom at Cooser Elementary. And so for this piece of evidence, I noticed that I included engagement strategies throughout the learning process, giving students opportunities to practice and use different learning modes to produce different learning outcomes and increase them for them. So for this evidence, students explored the essential question for that week, how do we measure time? And I created a worksheet for them, and they made a digital storybook as a class. So they filled in the sentence stem, I can measure time in blank by blank. They were practicing their writing. They were practicing their reading by rereading the sentence, drawing a picture, and then recording themselves so that they could hear back all of the things that they had produced. So it was requiring students to use different learning practices to meet one learning objective. And although I was able to engage my students throughout the learning experience, I realized that because my students had mastered one learning objective for one lesson, that didn't mean that my students were able to connect one lesson to the next so that they could overarch and meet the learning objectives for an entire unit. So I was still stuck on being able to engage my students throughout the learning process, including the learning that was being done throughout a unit, being able to connect all those lessons. And so that led me to my third piece of evidence. And this piece of evidence is from my student teaching experience that I just finished up in a second grade classroom at Cooser Elementary. And I did this I taught these lessons within a writing unit, and we learned about friendly letters. And so one thing that I did to engage my students in this lesson was having them write mystery friendly letters. And so students were able to put their names in a bag, and then they drew names from that bag. And whoever they got, they were to write a friendly letter to that friend. And so it required students to participate in an authentic task, something that was a real life application. They would really be able to understand those real life skills of writing those letters. So connecting it to the outside world for them. And they were engaged in writing these friendly letters to each other because it was a task that excited them. Some of my students didn't know each other on a deeper level, so it also helped their character development and engage them in that sense as well. So from my third piece of evidence, I realized that when the engagement strategies that I incorporate in my lessons are meaningful and are explicit, that I'm able to increase learning opportunities for my students. And so one plan for the future that I have, thinking about how I grab my students with a traditional hook, grab my students within a lesson, grab my students within a unit, I'm thinking, how can I continue to use engagement strategies to set up classroom procedures so that my learning environment is structured around different engagement opportunities for students to have across all content areas. And so one thing that I have looked into and is a way for me to grow professionally is by seeking opportunities to learn from others. So Dr. Anita Archer, she has developed active participation strategies. And so one way that I could take what Dr. Anita Archer does is I could structure my classroom and seat my students in learning pairs, so ones and twos. And so these are opportunities for students to engage in materials across all content areas by asking my students in writing, in math, in reading. Ones and twos, you're going to work together to answer this question. Ones, tell me what two said. Twos, tell me what one said. That active participation, that constant you do, you do, you do, you can do it together. Building that community. This plan for the future will help my classroom environment. It will increase the learning opportunities in the classroom environment that I hope to create in the future. And they're just small things that I can continue to do to keep my students engaged and be mindful about how these engagement strategies are meaningful for the learning environment, but also for the classroom environment. And so through all of my pieces of evidence, I have been able to synthesize my information and connect these dots. And one way that I think about it is through stoplights. So I created the Stop, Slow, Go as a reflective practice for myself. So the stop of my engagement pieces, the stop of my reflection was when I used a traditional attention-getting hook and I stopped there. I didn't continue with it, it wasn't meaningful, I needed to keep growing. So then the slow piece is when I slowly, gradually included those engagement practices in an entire lesson, and then I was able to engage students more, but it didn't necessarily mean that they understood an entire unit. The go process is using those meaningful engagement strategies to bridge across an entire unit to make sure that students can go along with those learning objectives and can really meet them. And so one way that I have learned about my pieces of evidence is that each piece has been that I've presented demonstrates my growth as an educator. I have learned how to create a learning environment that is conducive to student-led learning while gradually incorporating explicit engagement strategies within different parts of the learning environment and the classroom environment.